Right, so sorry about that. We got cut off from Zoom. So we're going to proceed on with Miss Harrison's interpretation of the use of props in inspector calls.
Okay, everyone. So in the opening stage directions, it's really important to know the use of props and staging, as well as characterisation. You can get a lot out of the use of props, and it might be something worth noting because not a lot of students tend to comment on those things. But it might just be something to note in terms of originality. So I'm going to focus on the use of champagne glasses mostly, because here we get this kind of idea that the Berlins are kind of bathing in unnecessary luxury and wealth. When you think of champagne, you know, it's a luxurious, expensive drink, which kind of is very symbolic and emblematic of them as people. You know, they have wealth and they want to be seen to be flaunting it. Same with, you know, a decanter of port, cigar boxes, cigarettes. At the time, and even now, they are considered luxuries. They're not necessities for people to live. And it's highlighting the fact that, yes, it's a luxury, but it's unnecessary. And that kind of segregates them and detaches them from the audience who would be watching it in 1945. They'd see it as very uncouth, distasteful. Remember, 1945 was a post-war audience, so they weren't used to, you know, the kind of luxuries that the Berlins have and that Priestley's showcasing through the use of his stage directions. I also think it's important to note that, again, the wealth and luxury that it connotes links to their materialist values. They are bothered about what they look to the outside world. You know, it's only later on that we kind of realise that the appearance that they put onto the outside world is only that. It's an appearance. It's not the reality of who they are as people. But again, it's about them being fashionable and being seen to have their lives together. I think it's also important to note as well that this luxury juxtaposes the basic standard of living that a post-war audience would be living in. You know, there would be an economic slump because of the money spent on the war, so people weren't used to this, and that's why it's almost like Priestley's setting us up to dislike them as people from the get-go, from these opening stage directions. He's setting us up as an audience to not like them as characters because of what they represent. Does Miss Wan have anything to add to that?
I think, yeah, I don't think I made it very clear for you guys at the beginning that the play was set in 1912. So that's really important because of what Miss Harrison has said, which was a really interesting point about how an audience would feel because it was actually performed in 1945 after the Second World War. So one of the things I thought, and I don't know if I'm correct in thinking about this, is this idea, like you said, that it is really uncouth. I like that word. And the idea that they are indulging in all these luxuries as well, even in 1912, because again, like I said, they've gained comfort from capitalism, whereas actually a large proportion of the people were actually suffering during this time period as well. So I think that it could be regarded as quite sort of impactful in the sense that it shows the inequality there as well, that they can indulge in these things where there's actually a lot of suffering and hardship elsewhere. I don't know if that's correct. I think that's something I would add.
Miss Marshall?
Yeah, so I think that's also highlighted again at the start of the quote with the inclusion of Edna in the opening stage directions as well. Edna's not a very big character, but she's an important one. She is important because she's not in it very much. And she represents the working class. So the fact that Edna, the parlour maid, is just clearing the table, that wording could be quite important because, again, it completely contrasts with the luxury that Miss Harrison's already discussed, that that's all she's good for. So the inclusion of her in that opening stage direction is quite important, and links to her kind of later on being the one that opens the door to allow in the inspector and for the first time shatter this sort of pretentious upper class world later on. So don't forget Edna, she's very important. I like Edna.
I like Edna. So we're going to move on to the description of the characters. So like I said, it's not just the setting, but it's also about how Priestley purposefully describes the characters. So like what Miss Harrison said, you really want to dislike this family before you even hear them speak. So I'm going to move on to Mrs. Marshall's going to take over this bit.
Okie doke. So have we got a quote? Yeah, a quote about splendid. Right, okay. That's the sort of word that Berling would use, actually, isn't it? It's quite cringy. Splendid. So Berling, then, his characterisation. Let's have a little look at Sybil and Arthur first of all. There they are. We can see them on our screen, looking already dislikable. But the way that Mr. Berling is described is quite important. So he's described as rather provincial in his speech. So his accent's quite important because we tend to lump the Berlings as this posh family. But actually, Priestley is quite specific about Mr. Berling's origins. And as we talked about earlier in the lesson, mentioned about how Mr. Berling had made his money, he's a self-made man, he's upwardly mobile, he's moving up. So he's not actually one of the upper classes, and that's important to remember because people play that Mr. Berling's upper class, but he's not. He's really kind of upper middle class. He's making his money, he's rising up, and being provincial. Now the meaning of the word provincial, it means sort of small town, regional. So he actually should have a regional accent rather than just a sort of a posh received pronunciation accent, which Mrs. Berling should have. So the actress playing Mrs. Berling and the children, because they will have been brought up to be upwardly mobile, should have quite a posh, plummy accent, whereas Mr. Berling should be trying to be posh in his accent, but there should be this twang, this regional twang to it, so it kind of highlights for the audience that he's not actually naturally born into money. Whereas Mrs. Berling, as it mentions in the stage directions here, is socially superior. She's actually from her parents, a lord and sorry, I'm going on to Mr. Gerald now, aren't I? But her parentage is from the aristocracy, a bit like Gerald, whose parentage is Lord and Lady Croft. Her background would have been born into an aristocratic type of lifestyle as well. So he's married above himself. He's done well for himself, told Berling, to rise up the ranks by marrying well, which has actually left him a little bit obsessed with his social status, because I think he's always worried about how he comes across, particularly to Gerald later on, because he is from the aristocracy. Berling is very careful to try and make sure that he follows the conventions, and he sort of shows off to Gerald a lot throughout the play, and tries to impress him, and feels quite worried maybe that maybe he might not be viewed by Lord and Lady Croft as being the right sort of family for marrying into. So he can be a bit uncomfortable with his social position, and that makes him more defensive throughout the play of the idea of anyone else rising up to threaten him in any way. What do we reckon to that, Miss Swan?
I don't think I could add any more to that. I don't know if Miss Harrison can. I think that's a pretty good interpretation. What do you think, Miss Harrison?
Yeah, it is really good. The only thing that I ever note to my students is that a second definition of provincial means to be narrow-minded and kind of closed-minded. So I think that's quite telling of who he is as a character, in the fact that he is kind of stuck in his ways and unable to accept anything that the inspector is trying to teach him through the story of Eva Smith. He is completely kind of got his blinkers on and blinded to any problems outside of his social circle.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I noted that down, and I'm glad you said that, because you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Definitely
It does
a good point.
To be provincial in your thoughts as well. Thank you. It's a good job we're doing this as a 3, isn't it?
Yeah. The power of 3.
Power of 3.
So shall we go on to the next interpretations then? I think they're the younger generation, which is quite important to sort of look at how they're presented as well. So are we all here?
We're here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know whether it cut off again. We could start off with Sheila, who is Mr. and Mrs. Burling's daughter. Like Mrs. Marshall said earlier, they're celebrating the engagement of Gerald, who is the character in the middle, and they're pretty pleased about it because Gerald is from a class background that is higher than Mr. Burling, so he feels like this marriage and this union will be very beneficial to him because of the status he would get from them to marry him, but also Gerald is the son of a wealthy manufacturer as well, so he thinks this is going to be very good for his business. But we should just, I'm digressing here, so we should go back to the presentation of Sheila, who has been described as very pleased with life and rather excited. When I look at this, I think part of it makes me feel like she's quite sheltered. She's raised within the comfort of the wealth of the Burlings. I don't know whether you guys could add any more to that.
Yeah, I think it fits in with the ease of life that she's experienced, that she is very sheltered, very protected from any unpleasantries in life. She genuinely, at the beginning of the play, has no idea that people like Eva Smith exist. She has no idea what life is like for working class women. She's quite shocked and horrified by the revelations that the inspector brings throughout the play. So I think that kind of smug, pleased with life is the perfect description of her at the beginning of the play, and also the description of her being excited. She's immature, excitable, fits in with some of the other stage directions later on, where she's really impressed by the material possession of the ring and just sort of a bit giddy and dizzy about things. Her character changes the most throughout of all the characters in the play, so it's quite a useful quote to have there to sort of show what she's like at the beginning and how she's been deliberately contrasted to the end.
Yeah, do you think that it's quite tragic in the way she's described, and the way where we hear how Eva Smith is described later on, that actually how different their lives are because of the backgrounds that they've been born into? It's like it's sort of pure chance that Sheila was born into the Burlings, and pure chance that Eva was a working class female. I feel like that's important.
Yeah, definitely. I think he definitely wants to highlight, because this is a play, a lot about the position of women, the timing of when the play was set, deliberately sort of before a lot of the sort of women's lib and the suffragettes and everything. I think it's one of the main things that he wants to highlight, is how just being born into a certain class as a woman makes your path very, very different, I think.
Miss Harrison, do you have anything to say about Gerald or Eric? You can take either.
Well, both are really interesting characters. I particularly like the stage direction about Eric, the fact that he's not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. Already there's kind of the bubblings of the breakdown in the family unit, just through Eric's stage directions alone. The fact that he's not quite at ease could suggest one of two things. I always think that, one, that he's obviously got this secret to do with Eva Smith, but also that he's not quite at ease in the family unit. He is, along with Sheila, is a character who changes drastically throughout the play. And I think he is kind of the first one out of the younger ones to voice socialist views. I think he says to Mr. Berlin, his father, that, you know, why shouldn't they try for higher wage? Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. So maybe it's to do with that. And I think, you know, the juxtaposition between the half shy and half assertive. You know, while he voices those kind of socialist tinged views in Act 1, it's completely the opposite in Act 3, when he is quite violent, quite aggressive towards his parents because of, you know, the revelation of how Eva Smith and his unborn child have become this victim of capitalism and capitalist greed. So yeah, I think it's really important to notice the juxtaposition between those two adjectives in shy and assertive. Miss Marshall, can you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I really like that definition, that interpretation. I really like what you said about the idea that he's the first one that actually raises something semi-socialist and actually saying, well, why shouldn't they? And I think that's to link it to that quote is really important, because you can see how he's constantly shut down, and how the half assertiveness then you could therefore link, based on what you've just said, to the idea that it's the inspector that eventually brings out that confidence in, well, both him and Sheila to actually assert their views properly at the end. Because what chance did they have being born into the family that they are in if they did have leanings towards socialism and actually acting upon them, because they've been brought up in this, you know, very cut off, cold capitalist household. You know, every time he tries to say something, even right from the beginning when he doubts Berling's speeches, which we'll come on to in the next lesson, he's constantly shut down and sort of trivialized and sort of discounted as being a bit silly. So I think that's a lovely link to the language there, the half shy, half assertive. He's not got the strength of character. He's young, he's troubled, deeply flawed, as you say. We're not saying he's a great character here, because he does some very horrific, questionable things in the play, but I think he's very much a product of his environment. That's why he is so troubled. I mean, it's interesting as well, I forgot to mention, things keep going back to me. I forgot to mention in my bit before about the seating around the table as well, the fact that Burling's at one end and Mrs. Burling at the other, and Eric is closest to the audience in how he is, so the fact that they get to see him first, him struggling with the drinking, that's deliberately made quite visible to the audience early on, to see how he is turned to drink because he isn't valued in the family, and because his father doesn't sort of, you know, he says later on, he's not the sort of man that a guy turns to when he's in trouble. And so he, you know, he really, that description of him, I think if you were going to take that quote in an essay, you could easily make it the basis of a really, really good character analysis of Eric, then, you know, zooming that in and out to look at things that happen later on. Love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really good points to make. I was thinking about with Gerald. Well, Eric is described in this way. It kind of, when you said something about him being a product of his own environment, I think Gerald is a product of his own environment as well, in the sense that he is this easy, well-bred young man about town, and his sort of wealth and status comes really naturally to him. Whereas when we look at Berling, I think Miss Harrison said this, like he has to sort of buy all these items to sort of show off his status, because he's and you know, because he's like quite, I don't know, provincial in his speech, he has to prove otherwise. Okay, there's this desperate need to sort of show off what he has in order to show off his status. Whereas for Gerald, it comes very naturally. Does anybody else have anything to say about Gerald at this point?
Yeah, sorry, go on, Mrs. Harrison, go for it.
So the bit that I always find interesting is the fact that Gerald, who is this, you know, high status aristocrat in the, well, he's not an aristocrat, but he's in the aristocracy, is described as well bred. And I think that, you know, when the Berlins and Gerald, particularly the older Berlins and Gerald, talk about Eva Smith, they talk about her, using quite dehumanized language. You know, they refer to her as that girl and girls of that class and a good sport and young and fresh and things like that. I think that the fact that, I might just be going off on a tangent here, but the fact that Gerald, who is, you know, supposed to be this high flyer in society, is described as well-bred by Priestley. Remember that this is still the stage direction. I think it's almost got that kind of, almost like a tinge of, you know, dislikability, the fact that he's against these kinds of people and he's kind of using their own language against them, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really interesting.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. Sorry, Miss Harrison, what you say? I mean, Mrs. Marshall.
No, I was just admiring the point. I think that that's a really nice idea, because I think, you know, when we've read, when we've geeked out and researched Priestley's memoirs, Gerald does basically represent the worst kind of man for Priestley. The idea that somebody that kind of hides behind their breeding, their class, and thinks they're better than everyone else. So I think, yeah, that there's a real dislike, because in his past, when Priestley went to university, he was mocked at university for some of his background, and he hated a lot of the other students there that had lived these lives of privilege. And so I think he does, I think you're right, I think you can really kind of see that real hatred, because like Miss Harrison said, this is the direct voice of the writer that we're hearing it from.
Yeah, I think just to sort of think about these stage directions, I think like Priestley's packed so much in about how he actually feels about capitalism. I think he sort of looks and describes these characters in a way that sort of just shows off the callousness of it. I think that these people are so distant from their own sort of, their behavior causes the suffering of each other. They live in this life of privilege. They're very self-content. They're sort of isolated from everybody. And I think that, and just before you even hear them speak, you already get a very strong impression about how Priestley feels about people who are in wealth.
Yeah. And you don't even feel like, I mean, regardless of all that, you don't even feel like they're likable as a family. They're not recognisable. They don't even like each other. And I think this opening little snapshot that we've analysed today in this lesson, you know, the use of the word cold, the way that they're seated at the other side of the table, there is a real distinct lack of that kind of family feeling that you would expect. And obviously we obviously touched on the fact that this is a 1945 audience that it's playing to, and the unity and the sense of unit and pulling together and the family feeling that you would get after a crisis like the war. It's happening now with our situation, the way that people pull together in times of crisis like this. I mean, right now, think about it, the family is the most important thing, the most powerful thing that we have when you're going through. So I'm not comparing this to a war, but it's the same sort of spirit, the way that people come together. And for that audience to be watching this family and for the play to be open in that way, it really highlights that cold sense of distance that sets him up to be able to make his socialist point that he wants to the audience. It gives a lot more power to his message.
I think even the idea of the tone of the stage direction being quite a celebration, that positive tone, I kind of feel like that sets them up even more for a bigger downfall when the inspector comes in as well, I think.
Yeah.
So is there anything we want to add before we finish off this lesson?
No, I think we all need a cup of tea now and a chocolate biscuit. Yes.
Well, right. Well, we're going to look at the introduction of the Burlings, well, Mr. Burling particularly, in the next session. So we're going to leave you here. Hopefully you made plenty of notes. Right.
Bye.
Bye.